the past few years, I've noticed an ever-increasing trend of negativity and overall toxicity in the animated sphere. Of course, negative discourse thrives online, and I'm not saying that this is unique to this section of the internet, but I do think the complaints and criticism have somewhat crossed a line where it seems that nothing can please these people. When animated films and live-action remakes are continuously the biggest draws at the box office and the absolute disdain online has never been higher, it leaves me confused. Does this community live within a bubble? Why are these opinions held to begin with? How did it get to this point? Today I want to cover all of that and maybe try to change people's perceptions just a little bit. Arrogant? Maybe. Ambitious? Definitely. I guess we'll see. As someone who watches and creates content based off of animated films and shows, I keep my finger on the pulse of these sentiments probably more than most. It's just what I do. I'm pretty well aware of future movie releases as soon as they're announced for the big studios. I love to scroll on Wikipedia and see what possible movies could be in production in anticipation. I analyze as many trailers as I can, trying to string together plots off of a handful of scenes. I book tickets and visit the cinema as soon as I can to see the movies and give my thoughts. I block out a day or so to binge watch big show dumps. And obviously, a lot of people aren't like me, and therefore, maybe they don't have as vested an interest in the content being good or watching out for fresh releases. If something of interest works its way into others' periphery, they're less inclined than someone like me to give it a chance. Now, you might think that this makes me more likely to like something that the general public don't. I think that's a fair assumption. I wouldn't be making this many videos on a particular topic if I didn't like it, right? Well, maybe. If someone is less interested in this format of movies and TV, they're probably going to watch it less, which means that they won't give things a chance unless they feel confident they're going to enjoy it. Fair enough, but maybe that makes them more invested in something being good, because if it's not, it's far more skin off their back than mine if I watch something that's bad. The worst thing that happens to me is I get to make a funny video complaining about the choices I made and move on. For them, it's far more frustrating. They've wasted time with nothing to gain. So maybe that makes them more critical of movies and shows. However, I wonder if that's just my personality. After all, there are a lot of fans out there that religiously follow upcoming releases of animated content. I'm not the only person on YouTube that makes content on these movies and shows. And I'm sure there are other creators on TikTok and other platforms that do reviews and talk about what's happening in the animated sphere. That's not to mention critics that work for various publishers online. The demand for opinions has never been higher, which is kind of surprising given 20 years ago you'd probably just see a one-sentence review for the latest Disney flick in your local paper. Keeps me in a job though, so I'm not complaining. If you think about it, it would make more sense for critics and enthusiasts to be more critical. I mean, I watch numerous shows and movies a year. Surely my standards would be set higher than the average person because they'd consume less. They'd obviously have some interest, otherwise they wouldn't contribute to these discussions at all, but they'd see what they like, be entertained by your average fanfare, and then call it a day. However, if you devote so much time to an interest, you'd think you'd get sick of the mundane and the mediocrity. You'd crave excellence because otherwise things start to get boring. How many times do I have to see the hero win? Oh man, I'm sick of this animation style. When are the studios going to do anything new? That is where I think a lot of these opinions come from. It's not from the casuals, but from people with vested interest. And this doesn't just include creators. This includes people commenting on forums, on trailers, on video essays. This is a much broader issue, and the root cause of it all? Nostalgia, but not in the way you'd think. To explain what's led me to this belief, we'll have to start with the catalyst for the video, Elio. About a month ago now, we saw Pixar release their brand new all-original film about a boy who gets abducted by aliens. The concept is kind of like a reverse E.T. When it released, I was really excited. These days, it's not too often you get original animated films, and the trailers had gripped me, so I was very keen. I saw it, I loved it, I reviewed it, and I called it a day. Like I said previously, when movies release, I get myself to the cinema as soon as I can, so I didn't really reflect all that much on the box office. Things weren't looking amazing, but I kind of figured that would be the case. A lot of original animated films these days just don't do all that well economically. I just hoped the goodwill would get the movie going and push the film more towards an Elemental style trajectory. Slow at the start and then positive reception gets butts in seats. You'd think that would be the case by now. It's sitting on an 82% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 90% audience score. However, as of writing this, it's only grossed around just shy of $140 million off a $150 to $200 million budget. Since now we're in early August, and that was around the time Elemental turned the corner on its box office earnings after having a similar mediocre start, I'm thinking my hopes are not going to turn into a reality. However, I still think it's a great film, and if you haven't seen it, you should. That's not why I'm talking about it here though. If you look at the general sentiment from critics, it seems the movie, like I said, is good. Same with audiences. But when you look at articles, video essays, or comment sections online everywhere you turn, there is dripping disdain and angry belittlement for the movie. This genuinely shocked me. I figured of all people that would support the movie, it would be the people in the animated fan base. This would be people that keep their watch for new animated films, especially because there's been such vocal disdain for sequels and remakes from these sources. I just thought the general public might take more convincing, so colour me surprised wherever I turn, there's essays, articles and comments critiquing everything from the quote-unquote bland and average story, the bean animation style, and the supposed lack of advertisement. And the obvious sinister villain behind it all? Disney. It's not the audience's fault for not going to see it. It's that darn House of Mouse. They want nothing more than their own film that they paid for to go into cinemas to make no money. Sound crazy? Yeah, because it is crazy. Let me ask you something. Say you were an author and you wrote a few books a while back that did really well. People talk about them all the time and say how great they are, how they were really your best work. You think, well, I could write a few more stories, follow these characters on another adventure. Then, despite them selling really well and reviewing well, you get negative feedback, and it's really loud. I can't believe they made Lancelot leave the swimming team. He's never had a desire to learn archery before. This wipes away all his arc about friendship and loyalty in Dragon Club, The Revenge of the Octopus. This author's clearly just milking the books and has no true understanding of the character anymore. It's the same with the prequel they're writing about Cassandra before the Emu Wars. Or when they released an illustrated version of My Badger as a Spy. Can't they think of anything original? So the author then takes time to think of a new idea, spends the time to write something new, divides up the rights between the publisher and themselves, it releases and people read it and like it, but it sells poorly and everyone says, oh, clearly they only want to write sequels. People try and argue. Disney just wants their own movies to do well. They don't want Pixar to do well. Do people not realize that Disney bought Pixar with the express intention of having another animated studio under their belt, making movies which then make them money? Why would it make any sense for Disney to have less movies make money? If you view Disney as a greedy corporation, at least be consistent here. I'm sure the "you're a Disney shill" comments have well and truly hit the video already, which, sure, you wouldn't want facts to get in the way of your blind hatred for popularity points online. I'll critique Disney when they deserve it. Like when Bob Iger was being an absolute worm and a slug for not wanting to pay his employees fair wages. Yes, Bob, I'll never let up on that.
An elephant never forgets.
However, to me, you lose credibility of your argument when it becomes obvious that you're projecting an opinion over what makes sense. What could make more sense than a company wanting to be profitable? Disney wanting to lose money on a film doesn't make any sense in any way. I've seen people mention that Disney wants Pixar to go the way of Blue Sky Studios, which just shows how little they understand the nature of what happened there. Disney bought Fox, which included Blue Sky. Since Blue Sky was the least profitable studio they owned, they had to cancel their upcoming work and close it down. However, Disney still had the rights and they're continuing with the IP under a brand new studio they just made. This can't happen with Pixar, and it won't. For one, animated films have proven in recent years to be the most profitable films at the box office. Pixar, despite the original films not doing so well, much like Disney's I might add, have big franchises that Disney absolutely relies on. Toy Story, The Incredibles and so on. Two, if Pixar then dissolved and Disney just absorbed it into their animated studio, they don't have to hire more people to work on a second and possibly third animated film per year, otherwise they're losing money. How much money is it really saving them having one less CCO of a studio in comparison to losing some money on an original film? It just doesn't add up, does it? So that's Disney sabotage out of the way. That encompasses the supposed lack of advertising as some insidious plot to cuck themselves. Genuinely, this film had to have the most trailers out of any animated movie in recent memory, purely from the fact that they reworked the movie after they put out that original advertisement, changed directors, and moved the release dates around to make some money with Inside Out 2. Posters were everywhere, trailers were on TV and in front of other movies that everybody went to see, like Lilo and Stitch. It's a bogus excuse and a stretch at best. This leaves two other excuses, animation style and storyline, and we'll attack the animation style argument first, shall we? Now, everyone has their own personal taste. I'm not saying that I have the popular opinion in any way, and I fully understand that it's to each their own. However, I'll call bullshit when it seems like an excuse to pull it out of thin air as to why fans aren't seeing a movie. The animation is barely dissimilar to any animated film put out by Disney or Pixar in the last 15 years. Yes, each film has a slightly different take, but for the most part, characters have appeared more cartoonesque with big eyes and rounded features. And you want to know why? It's because those features are cute and are a big draw for kids. It's why all the toys you see these days have those big googly eyes. Kids love that stuff. You're going to try to tell me that since 3D animation became the widespread animation style and led to numerous billion-dollar box office grosses, that just a small tweak of that style is the reason people aren't going to see this one movie. The style that differs ever so slightly between Disney and Pixar and Dreamworks and Illumination, which have all had movies that perform well. Oh, and look, the studio that differs its animation style the most, Dreamworks, is the least profitable of them. By far. Sorry Dreamworks, I do love you, but the point needs to be proved. The market clearly likes it, even if Elio didn't do that well. This isn't a reflection on the visual style. It's just a different artistic opinion. It's not a market-accurate opinion either. But if you genuinely don't like the movie because his mouth is bean-shaped or whatever, well, I guess that's your prerogative, isn't it? Now we get to the final argument. Bland and average story. Again, this one's up for the most interpretation, and you can like or dislike a story. That's fine with me. Maybe you don't connect with it. To me, that seems the most fair argument that anybody can make. However, I'm not going to let these arguments off that quickly, because if it was just a case of, hey, this movie wasn't for me, I'd get it. Those opinions, though, are few and far between, because the way stories work is having common elements to the human condition and writing them into a 1.5 to 2 hour format. I'd accept your argument if you said something like, I don't like sci-fi, I don't like alien stories, that would make sense, and it's actually my personal attribution as to, at least partially, why this movie didn't do well. I think you could also account for space fatigue between Lilo and Stitch because, at the best of times, Disney sci-fi performs terribly. I don't know why Disney doesn't scrap it except for Star Wars and Stitch. That's throwing money away based on their past experiences. Look at me, I'm writing these negative Nancy's arguments for them. If they came at it from a reasonable approach and said, hey, aliens just aren't my thing, I only like Stitch because he looks like a dog, I think that's cool. That's a fair opinion. Not, did you know Disney marketed Elio against Lilo and Stitch because they wanted people to be sick of space movies and not go to see Pixar's movie? You shouldn't see it anyway though, because the story's so repetitive. Boo-hoo, some kid's an orphan, again, and he makes some friend in space before becoming friends with some kid that beat him up. Toxic much? Whilst they reduce these new movies to mere basic story points, in the same breath they overanalyze and act as though old animated movies were breaking ground with galaxy-brained plots. I remember when Pixar wrote really original stories, like when the main character who'd been raised in a suppressive society excels until learning that it was all a lie and tries to change the system from within. You know what that movie really is? It's about two monsters who accidentally have to look after a child and get her home. Monsters, Inc. Look, at the end of the day, you can over or underanalyze any movie you want. I'm so certain that if any old Pixar movies came out today, they would actually suffer the same level of criticism that new movies do now. If you watch movies and shows as much as I do, the broader outline is roughly the same for most of them, really. The hero character has something happen to them that makes them feel on the outs and alone. They go on a journey and they find a place where they belong. Other stuff happens, but that's just flavoring. The best part for these supposed critics, though, they can just use that excuse whenever they want to get out of jail free card to hate and seem more cultured than they really are. I want to reiterate, it's perfectly fine for you to not like a movie. It's fine for you to critique things you don't like. It's fine to have an unpopular opinion. I've done this on many occasions. The only thing is, though, that this isn't really that. Something is off when critics and general audiences say something's great and the internet disagrees. The argument, of course, could be made that audiences mustn't think it's that good if they're not going to see it, but the market proves time and time again that originals just aren't doing well anymore, so I don't think this movie's narrative is specific to blame. So that was the catalyst for me. But this video isn't about the Elio backlash, but rather the reason I felt like I needed to make the video. Because this trend of tearing down animated or live action movies limb from limb has been going on for quite a while, but I figured as long as it wasn't to an original film, one that was received well, mind you, something that these fans have been clamoring for, it was just a difference of opinion. Now though, my suspicion of needless rage has been confirmed, and it's time to talk about it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is the trend that's been happening for a while. Not with the severity, of course, but the seed started around the mid-2010s. What happened in the 2010s to start this, you might ask? Live-action remakes. Since the 90s, Disney has been producing these movies. However, they didn't come out in a time where widespread internet access was so easily available. Plus, there was only 3 released over a span of 6 years, and then those types of films weren't made again for another decade. Then we had 2 in 2010, one which did very well and tonally probably fit more with the previous era of remakes, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, and the second, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which, whilst the numbers look okay, it was a box office disappointment and was received terribly to boot. So Disney decided to be a bit more careful and didn't make another until 4 years later with Maleficent. That performed pretty well and they continued on. It started with 1 remake per year, then quickly went up to 2 in 2016, but one of these was a sequel, so that didn't really count, right? Then Beauty and the Beast came out and became their most successful remake to date. However, that was also the film I heard the most misgivings about. People critiquing Emma Watson's singing voice, people complaining about Lumiere not being hot. Weird, I know. I think people had an issue about the addition of the Beast's travel book. There was also probably some discontent from conservatives about making LeFou gay or whatever. I think maybe there were some critiques about the Beast's design as well. Oh, and there were definitely rumblings about there being a black man in rural France. Basically, there were people looking for something to hate a lot online, and it just didn't add up to the general consensus. It performed really well at the box office, and was received well by critics and audiences alike. I personally really liked the remake, but I wasn't making videos then, and I didn't share my opinion at the time. There also weren't as many creators sharing their thoughts on these movies back then either. Reviewers existed, don't get me wrong, but they weren't as popular or as prolific as these days. Anyway, so to me, that was the first rumbling. The other remakes existed and also performed well, aside from the Tim Burton sequel anyway, but they were of older films. People didn't have as much personal nostalgia or care. They were happy with different stories being told, like from the villain's POV, or more depth being given to characters such as Cinderella. Christopher Walken's rendition of I Wanna Be Like You was mocked hard, but for the most part, people enjoyed The Jungle Book. Again, these were just really small critiques compared to now, but that's why I think this era and Beauty and the Beast were where the warning flags were flashing that things were going to get worse online. In 2019, Disney released 5 remakes. Yes, 5. I can only assume that at least one of these was meant for 2018 to join Christopher Robin, but got delayed for some reason. We had Dumbo, Aladdin, The Lion King, Maleficent 2, and Lady and the Tramp. 4 of those released in cinemas, and The Lady and the Tramp was a digital release on Disney+. Of the 4 that did release, 2 grossed over $1 billion, and The Lion King became the highest grossing animated film at that point in time. Personally, I only really like Lady and the Tramp out of those 5, but they perform better for audiences than my opinion. Aladdin, The Lion King, Maleficent were also incredibly well liked from general audience ratings. That's reflected in the box office too. Aladdin and The Lion King more than Maleficent, but she still grossed reasonably. According to the internet though, they blew up with the inundation of remakes. Outwent any opinion at all that was positive about these movies, and critiques became increasingly more harsh. The internet hated the way The Lion King was made, the unexaggerated expressions on the animals, the voice acting, and on top of that they hated how it looked like Africa, despite the fact that that's where the story is set. At that point it was clear that people did not want the live action part of the remakes. What was more important was getting the tone right in comparison to the film it was retelling. Fair enough, I myself hold some of these opinions. Not to the severity that all remakes are the scum of the earth, but there were definitely improvements to be made in my eyes. Now I know what you're going to say, Smarty Pants, I thought you were talking about unfair critiques of animated movies, not live action remakes. All in good time, my friend. To me, these issues are rather intertwined and connected. For the most part, the animated films were spared these complaints. Yeah, there are a growing number of voices concerned about the increase in sequels from Disney and Pixar's animated studios, but the movies were performing really well, and Disney didn't release all that much at the back half of the 2010s. People argued that they weren't making animated films because the remakes were performing better, but the reality was that the scheduling seemed to get a bit messy. Zootopia released in 2016, which would have made more sense for a 2015 release, to have a bit more of an even spacing between Big Hero 6 and Moana. Then there was a movie called Gigantic, which was in heavy production until that got scrapped. So we went 3 years before we got another Disney animated film, with Frozen 2 coming to save their asses with a big $1 billion gross. Pixar was more heavily focused on sequels in the back half of the 2010s. From 2016 we had Finding Dory, Cars 3, Incredibles 2 and Toy Story 4 over the span of 3 years. Coco was the only original movie made at that point. There were some rumblings about there being too many sequels, but it wasn't that loud. After all, it had been 13 years since Finding Nemo, and 14 years since The Incredibles. Cars, everyone just viewed it as a cash grab anyway, so that movie kind of exists on its own plane of existence. Plus, the kids that grew up with Cars were probably excited. I don't know. Toy Story 4 got the most complaints because of how 3 ended, but once it released, it actually got a pretty popular reception. I definitely felt on the outs at the time, considering I thought it washed away everything that made Woody who he was. Since then, I've rewatched the movie and my perception's changed, but so too has the internet's. It's far more divided than it was previously. Not everybody hates it, but it's far more even than it was 6 years ago. If you look at other studios around the time, you had Illumination, which just capitalized on the Minions spin-off movie hitting $1 billion, followed up by new stories with The Secret Life of Pets and Sing both performing really well. They released a third Despicable Me movie in 2017, which again crossed that $1 billion mark, another new movie, an animated Grinch film, and then The Secret Life of Pets 2, which rounded out the end of the 2010s, both performing positively. Dreamworks didn't fare as well economically, but only released 2 sequels in that back half of the decade, Kung Fu Panda 2 and How to Train Your Dragon 3. The rest of their original movies scarcely managed to hit the $200 million mark apart from Trolls, which got them close to $350 million, and The Boss Baby, which grossed about as well as their sequels. So where does that leave us at the end of the decade? Well, you have a massive influx of sequel films being made and a record number of live-action remakes hitting the big screen. A far cry from what people were used to, where Disney hadn't released a sequel animated film on the big screen since its first attempt in 1990, and it performed so badly they canned the idea of ever doing that again until 28 years later with Ralph Breaks the Internet. Apart from Toy Story 2, Pixar hadn't touched sequels for its first 15 years. Dreamworks quickly jumped on the sequel bandwagon though, but almost every original movie they made in the 2000s was a smash hit. You had Shrek, Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda, with them entering the 2010s with How to Train Your Dragon. Yes, the early 2010s saw the introduction of Illumination, but again, they weren't pulling anything we hadn't seen before. Just like Pixar and Dreamworks, once they had a smash hit, they capitalized. It was different once you hit that mid-2010 mark, a distinctive shift in the animated landscape. There were complaints, yes, but because the sequels at least from Disney and Pixar hadn't really hit its stride too hard yet, or were follow-ups from films over a decade old, people mostly let it slide. The complaints didn't really pick up until 2019 with Toy Story 4 and the 5 remakes in 1 year. Then we hit another curveball, the COVID-19 pandemic. Just when Disney and Pixar had a slew of original animated films lined up for the cinemas, COVID shut the world down and so they had to be released on Disney's streaming service. Onward from Pixar technically made a cinematic debut, but was released a few weeks later on Disney Plus due to everybody staying home. Since everywhere in the world had different variations on lockdown, some movies were released theatrically later down the line, such as Raya and the Last Dragon and Encanto from Disney. This also happened for Soul, Turning Red and Luca, although they weren't given an initial theatrical release, but rather a full re-release in cinemas following the loosening restrictions. The same happened for live-action remakes. Mulan and Cruella were both released on Disney Plus due to the pandemic. Pinocchio and Peter Pan and Wendy were also streaming exclusive, and whilst they blame COVID for this, I think Disney could see the writing on the wall that these movies would not have performed well at the box office. Best decision they ever made. Illumination fared pretty well during this time. They obviously couldn't release a movie for a couple of years, but Sing 2 performed pretty well in 2021 considering people's hesitation to go to the cinemas so soon after restrictions lessened. 2022 they definitely hit their stride with $1 billion gross for Minions: The Rise of Gru, and then again in 2023 with the Super Mario Bros. Movie. People love to punch down on Illumination, but man, they know what they're doing. Dreamworks, on the other hand, had 6 movies to release between 2020 and 2022. Because they don't have their own streaming service, it seemed to be far more of a shit show than Disney had it. Trolls 2, The Croods: A New Age, and Boss Baby Family Business released in cinemas sporadically along with digital release. Somehow, Croods made $250 million in that time, which honestly has to be commended. Spirit Untamed performed terribly, no surprises there. Thankfully, The Bad Guys came in and performed pretty well for a new release by DreamWorks standards these days. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish truly saved the day though, again by DreamWorks standards. At this point, if they made the type of money Illumination makes on their movies, I think they'd assume it had to be some sort of mistake. They're probably holding out for Shrek next year, but we'll see about that. So in that early era of the 2020s, Disney and Pixar had slowed up on the sequels, but Illumination and DreamWorks had committed hard. Still, the remakes existed though, and now Pixar fans were getting heated. Why, might you ask? Well, a lot of reasons. It started in 2020 when people were critiquing Onward for looking like a Disney or DreamWorks film, and then Luca and Turning Red were sent to Disney+, whilst Encanto got a try in cinemas. So people assumed that Disney intentionally didn't want Pixar movies to release in cinemas for some reason. That's not to mention the debate about Luca's Studio Ghibli-inspired animation style and the whole Turning Red drama. People just couldn't relate to a 12-year-old Chinese-Canadian girl with a difficult relationship with her mother as opposed to, a disabled, half-orphaned tropical fish that gets abducted by a dentist, and his dad has to go save him accompanied by some random fish with amnesia. Or there's the fact that the menstrual cycle was briefly mentioned for one scene, and so suddenly that meant the whole movie was solely about periods. Don't get me started, because I won't stop raging about how stupid those critiques were. I'm certain I lost brain cells hearing those very dumb takes. Then we get to 2022, and Pixar's rolling up its sleeves once again. They're getting a theatrical release for their new film, Lightyear, and technically it's original, but it's based off of Toy Story. And what could go wrong? Well, apparently a lot. The film was shrouded in controversy. There was this whole thing about a Don't Say Gay bill being passed in Florida, which restricted children being taught about sexual orientation in schools, and because Disney hadn't really said anything despite their theme park being located in Florida, it caused a big kerfuffle and insinuations were being made that Disney was anti-gay, and then Pixar said, well, we support gay people, so we're putting a same-sex kiss back in our movie because it's Disney's fault that it wasn't going to be in there. I mean, to be honest, you had to squint to see it when watching the movie, but whatever. So the movie released, and what do you know, another box office disappointment. Barely crossed over its public budget, but as we know, those numbers don't count for advertising and other costs, so yeesh, that was a doozy. Especially for something based in the world of Toy Story. Fans blamed Disney, of course, saying the reason people didn't go and see it was because the general public were used to seeing Pixar films on Disney+. Meanwhile, Pixar claimed that Disney blamed them for the failure for the same-sex kiss. Let's remember they stated that Disney were the ones who opposed the kiss and any quote-unquote gay themes in the movies. I was somewhat skeptical with how easy it was for Pixar to so publicly blame Disney and act like the white knight, but I could see how a huge corporation could be conservative based off of money and politics. So imagine my surprise when I went to see Strange World 5 months later. One of the lead protagonists, a teenage boy, has a very obvious crush on another teenage boy and is verbally and directly acknowledged numerous times throughout the film. He gets advice from his granddad about it. He talks about his affections numerous times, and it ties into his identity as wanting to be different from his father. This is something that his crush understands. It's not the only thing that makes up his character, but it's a significant part of his personal arc and story. Now, whilst there's no kiss in the film, the storyline isn't something you could easily cut out of a film. Obviously, being able to have both would be the ideal, but to frame Disney as being so against having any sort of LGBTQ storyline or character in their film, only to be so significantly outplayed, is honestly hilarious. The film did poorly, of course, but it wasn't because of the same-sex storyline. The film was just bad. It looked bad and it wasn't entertaining. I only went and saw it because it's my job. Pixar and its fans are still trying to peddle this argument now with Elio, although at least this year it's now getting directed to its own head, Pete Docter. I struggle to believe that Disney had that much control over the narrative 3 years ago, if they publicly said that they were putting it back in as a middle finger to Disney, and then it was so tame compared to Disney's actual storyline and relevance to a gay character. That's neither here nor there though. It's just a drop in the bucket to this string of drama and salt around fresh releases and why they didn't perform well. No one really seemed to care that Strange World didn't do well, and fair enough, it was just a bad movie. The punches weren't about to quit though. In 2023, Pixar released Elemental, which was doing absolutely terrible when I first saw it. However, through the power of TikTok memes and the Korean market, it managed to gross almost enough to cover their ass. The fact that they got close to $500 million and that it still wasn't enough says something very concerning though. Disney's Wish once again performed terribly. Despite its public budget and box office gross, according to Deadline, when all said and done, it lost around $130 million. Honestly, I enjoyed the film well enough, and I actually kind of liked the soundtrack. It got a lot of hate online, but I still return to knowing what I know now, and I stand by my opinion that Magnifico's villain song is a bop. Despite another year of original movies, Disney and Pixar aren't doing a whole lot better. I do remember distinctly people complaining about Elemental's animation style, and therefore they were uninterested in seeing it. It confused me quite a lot at the time because of how much the previous, more cartoonesque style had been hated on by Pixar fans. Red flags were waving. But it ended up making a comeback, so I let my concerns wander to the back of my mind. Complaints about Wish I could understand more. It was an odd choice, but at least I thought they were trying to listen to fans calling for a return to 2D, and had tried something new. It did look better in the cinema from memory, but it still had this look of being unfinished that wasn't to my personal tastes. The movie definitely got overhated for what it was, but it didn't matter. It performed terribly, and Disney will never try something like that ever again. Maybe 2D theoretically could return, but certainly not that hybrid format. This was the year that Pixar said, screw it, we need to make some goddamn money. So they swapped out Elio for 2024, and brought in Inside Out 2. Wise choice there, and they smashed it. It became the highest grossing animated film at that point in time, and is widely beloved and critically acclaimed. Disney did really well too, $1 billion gross to accompany Inside Out 2 with Moana 2. However, the sequel to Moana was not afforded the same grace online. It got a positive reception from critics and general audiences, but you wouldn't know it according to the internet. There were various criticisms, the first being that they thought it was just a bad film, the second that the soundtrack was awful and too pop music sounding, the third was the pacing, and the fourth was something to do with the production. At the time I made my review on the film, it seemed to be the only positive one in existence. I got a few comments talking about how the animators had to rush the project and Disney was putting unfair pressure on its employees because they were scrambling for money and wanted to change the Moana show into the movie. Now, I knew that the show was being reworked into the movie, but I'd heard no news about Disney putting extra pressure on its staff. Nothing like what I'd heard was happening with Marvel's visual effects team. Since then I did some research and I only found that Disney changed where they were animating the movie, which was in their Vancouver studio instead of the California one due to the fact that the show was already going to be animated there. In fact, it was stated that the reason they could turn it around so fast from show to movie was because supposedly most of the animation's only done a year before the film's release. The reason they made the switch up probably had something to do with money, but apparently many of the higher-ups also thought the story was too good for a mere show, and they were right. I'm not going to go in depth on all the critiques others have spun for Moana 2. You can watch my review for my opinions on the movie if you want. I'll just say that apart from having prior knowledge that the movie was going to be a TV show, and with that information being able to easily piece together where they would have broken up the episodes, everything was amazing. I love the movie, and I'll not hear a bad word about the soundtrack. Illumination also released an original and then a sequel in 2023 and 2024 respectively. We got Migration at the end of 23, which did pretty well for a fresh movie, grossed over $300 million. Despicable Me 4 in 2024 grossed $1 billion, and whilst it wasn't my favourite, I could see how kids and families would enjoy it. Meanwhile, Dreamworks pumped out the movies. Between 2023 and 2024, they released 5 films. Ruby Gillman, which I didn't go to see, and nobody else seemed to go to see either. Trolls 3 did okay, Orion and the Dark released on Netflix, Kung Fu Panda 4 did well enough, grossing over $500 million, and The Wild Robot performed well for an original with over $330 million. So Dreamworks and Illumination both gambled with new IP. It seemed to pay off pretty well for them in the end. Ruby Gillman not so much, and Orion doesn't really count because it was released on Netflix, but they got there. There were once again complaints, of course. People were upset with Kung Fu Panda because Tai Lung wasn't in it enough, despite the fact that fans had been clamoring for him to return to the franchise. They also didn't like Zhen being voiced by Awkwafina, and they also didn't appreciate her appearing in an Illumination movie and then a Scuttle in the live-action Little Mermaid movie. Really, it was just a serious hate campaign against Awkwafina that I don't really understand. I think she has an awesome voice that's perfect for the role she plays, and the kids love it. Yes, let's forgive Jack Black for always playing the same dude in every single movie, but not Awkwafina. I say this as an avid Jack Black stan. I can fully acknowledge that it sucks voice actors don't get bigger roles, but let's not pretend this is some issue Awkwafina caused. Celebrities have been front and center in animated movies for at least 20 years or more. The only reason you're hating on her is because you're a bit of a bully, and you have nothing else to do but be a hateful person. I just don't get it. Speaking of live-action remakes, we also had, like I said, The Little Mermaid in 2023, which performed positively, and Mufasa the Lion King from last year, which sits in this category, but is also an original story that did really well, grossing $733 million. Honestly, I liked both these remakes, Mufasa more than Little Mermaid, but both were good to great. So imagine my surprise, and I know I shouldn't be at this stage, but I was, when people were hating on the Mufasa soundtrack. Apparently Lin-Manuel Miranda phoned it in, according to these people. I thought this was the best soundtrack he's ever written. Granted, I haven't seen Hamilton, so I'm sorry if that's blasphemous, but that is seriously how much I love the songs. So many of them were great, and I would pay to see a Broadway musical put together of this story. People are still trying to critique the animation style of the animals, despite significant improvement from the 2019 Lion King, and it was perfectly acceptable. The story was original and great. I might have had some critiques, which I still stand by, but for the most part, it was enjoyable. Even the acting seemed better from recurring characters. I couldn't fault the film in that regard. Now, that leads us to this year. So far, we've had Dogman from Dreamworks, which did okay. Pretty low gross of $145 million, but it had a low budget. I didn't really see many people talking about it though. I personally really liked it. Next we have Elio, which I already discussed in depth earlier, but yeah, it's not doing great. Then we've had 3 remakes. 2 from Disney and a first from Dreamworks. Snow White, I'm sure you're well aware about how much drama that dredged up. I mean, where do you start with the dwarf controversy, the casting of Rachel Zegler, the Palestine-Israel conflict, how bad the visuals were looking initially, people clamoring about how nostalgic they were for the original movie and how ungrateful and heinous Zegler's comments were about it, people clowning on Gal Gadot for her acting, just so much hate. Too much, honestly. I was shocked about how much I actually enjoyed the film. Similarly with Mufasa, there were 1 or 2 quibbles, but genuinely, the character development was great, the visuals improved massively in the cinema, my god, the soundtrack. I wish Disney would make this into a Broadway musical. The songs are slept on, and that's a shame. I would rewatch that movie in a heartbeat. Lilo and Stitch was another great remake that got a lot of backlash, even all the way back into its production. People lost their shit at the intermittent casting announcements because they thought characters like Cobra Bubbles wouldn't appear, even though he did. The guy they cast as David got fired for using a racial slur, and I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it definitely added to the chaos of everything. There were losers attacking a 20-year-old for looking too white and questioning her ethnicity, just really gross stuff. Then the film released and it did well. Really well. Just crossed over $1 billion and a sequel's confirmed. However, people were significantly upset by the creative decisions in the movie, where Nani gives custody to Lilo to her neighbor so she can go study, how Jumba becomes the main villain, and how Gantu was unceremoniously cuddled together. And I don't disagree with these critiques, but people take them a bit far and they say the film is absolutely garbage because of it. There's no nuance, there's just blind rage. Clearly it didn't matter economically though. Then we had How to Train Your Dragon, which released a couple of months ago, and has done pretty well for itself. There hasn't been much negative feedback I've seen for it since it released. I think from memory there was more of a divide, but the longer the film's been out, those negative voices have been drowned out by positive reception. However, when the film was being made, people definitely went nuts over the Astrid casting and some of the background characters that were of different ethnicities. Thankfully that's died down, but still, wasn't acceptable. It was weird. Interestingly, there's been a recent film that's been going absolutely viral. Kpop Demon Hunters. You may see I've made just a few videos on the movie. It's truly fun and amazing and has captured widespread attention. Even animation fans have been praising this movie, and that's good, right? Well, it should be. But as we know, we can't have simple optimism and compliments. No, we have to bring others down whilst raising the things we like up. People are using this movie to say, see, this is what Pixar should be doing. They use this in direct reference to Elio's flop. And I can tell you right now, if Pixar had put this forward as a concept, they would have been torn apart online. I'm not saying a big studio couldn't make a film like this, but I am saying that it would be unexpected and they would have received backlash. Maybe Dreamworks or Illumination, but not Disney or Pixar. I don't see how it would ever have been accepted. They're saying about how Sony Animation is quote-unquote winning, referencing Kpop Demon Hunters, the Spider-Verse films, and now the new trailer for the upcoming film GOAT, I assume. And I mean, sure, good for them. The ones that have released are great movies, and I'm very excited for the new GOAT film. I'm all for more animated studios doing well, but using that to bring another studio down when they didn't even make a bad movie and you've been begging for original films yet tear it down on the flimsiest excuses is maddening. I honestly think by the end of this month they might want to delete some of these statements, as the next animated film I see being made by Sony is an adult quote-unquote romantic sex comedy about dogs. No, I'm not kidding. If that's what you're looking for, I'm sorry, I can't help you, but please leave my channel. So what does that tell us as of right now? It seems that at best, remakes that are good are ignored, or worse, ripped apart. Then if something is slightly bad, they'll rip it apart. Then if something is heinously awful, they'll rip it apart, or sometimes it'll be so bad they ignore it completely. For animated movies, it's an absolute gamble. However, it seems like the studio you're produced by matters. Dreamworks gets an easier pass. Illumination always seems to be looked down on, so most people underestimate them, or they don't care. They might blame Illumination for where animated films have been headed tonally, insulting them as bad movies and hating on the minions, but that's pretty much it. Disney and Pixar, those studios are in the sights of almost anyone with a loud voice online. Vitriolic hatred for these studios has become worse and worse over the years. It doesn't matter whether a film's genuinely good or not anymore. These people are looking for something to hate to boost their own ego, and to use these supposed critiques to make themselves look clever. You know what the sad thing is though? I can kind of understand. Back when I was a teenager and I thought I knew everything, I figured animated films were just for kids. There was no enjoyment there, the minions were nothing but fart jokes and boomer memes on Facebook. Why would I care about watching that trash? I'm a true intellectual. I enjoy things like The Grand Budapest Hotel. A true Oscar snob I was, with dumb opinions like they still share for animated movies. I got knocked out of that real fast once I became an adult and I caught up on all the great films I'd missed out on being ridiculous. I learned that just because a piece of media isn't trying to swerve my expectations or constantly doing something new, doesn't mean it's not good. I realized that actually, the movies I always want to return to are the ones filmed with warmth and happiness, that leave you feeling cozy with a smile on your face. That's not to say other genres aren't great too, and I still enjoy a wide variety of content, but my point is that creating these ridiculous hoops to jump through for a story to be acceptable is just creating further disappointment. It seems that these people are latching onto an era that has somehow passed us by, but also remained with us in the forms of sequels and remakes. I think nostalgia's blinding them from enjoying a retelling of something they watched so often as a kid. They can't handle a new story coming in and gripping children like it did when they were small. It's not the same, it's not as good, back in my day it was better. Let me let you in on a little secret. It hasn't changed, not really. Illumination is still producing the same silly content that we were getting from Dreamworks back in the 2000s. Dreamworks is trying to find their feet again, but they can still produce that same funny charm even today. Disney still produces heartwarming and wonderful stories with great heroes. Pixar still takes us on an emotional roller coaster and focuses on connection. Yes, they look a little different now, but it's still there. In the end, hating on these new movies, how does that make you happy? It can't. And once you stop taking yourself so seriously, you can see there's lots of fun to be had. And then when you do watch something truly terrible, it makes it all the more funny. I want to reiterate that there's nothing wrong with having a difference of opinion. Having critiques is a good thing. I'm not saying you need to be positive all the time. There's nothing wrong with disliking something everybody else likes. Even raging about it can be entertaining. We've all been there, and sometimes a fresh perspective is really good, and it helps us see it in a different way. At this point, though, it's clear that it's not an isolated incident. This isn't a few bad movies strung together. It's a repeated and coordinated attempt to discredit anything Disney or Pixar put forward to make themselves seem more intelligent than a multi-billion-dollar company. The true Disney golden age has passed us by forever, and the Disney and Pixar have no idea what they're doing. It's funny that they criticize these companies for capitalizing on people's nostalgia when these complainers are the very ones that are holding on to it tightest of all. They can shame the general audience for continuing to see the films they like all day, but when they continue to enjoy them, I wonder who the true nostalgists are. Desiring originality and fresh ideas is all well and good. It's something I look forward to and clamour for myself, but using that as an excuse to bring down good stories in animation is not genuine criticism. It's just looking to mindlessly hate. There's space to share your thoughts and wishes for variety in animation or for fresh stories without bringing down something that's genuinely good that doesn't fit into your preconceived notion of how it should be. I can only hope that far more people live in a much more optimistic state about movies than what the internet would lead you to believe. With all that being said though, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the state of movie criticism? Do you think it's fine as is, or do you think something needs to change? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.